Give the gentleman the best in the house.
Yes, sir.
I'll be back in a minute.
On a mountain in Virginia stands a lonesome pine.
This takes me back. The sound of Laurel and Hardy performing The Trail of the Lonesome Pine from their 1937 film Way Out West.
Very soon she'll belong to me, for I know she's waiting there for me 'neath that lone pine tree.
Laurel and Hardy were a British-American comedy duo during the early classical Hollywood era of American cinema, consisting of Englishman Stan Laurel and American Oliver Hardy. And for those of us of a certain age in the UK, they seem to be on TV all the time, especially on a Saturday morning. And it always seemed to be that particular song from that particular film.
Like the pine, I am lonesome for you. In the blue mountains of Virginia, on the trail.
Now, as you can hear, the song refers to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And the Blue Ridge Mountains are located in the eastern United States, extending over 800 kilometres southwest from southern Pennsylvania through Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee and Georgia. And you're probably wondering, is there a connection between the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia and standards? Well, there is, kind of. At least there is for this episode of The Standard Show.
Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
BSI presents The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill. Today's episode is a letter from America.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs, and this is The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards. And in this episode, we're bringing you a slightly different slice of the standards world. Now, as well as Laurel and Hardy singing about the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in the United States, this episode has also been inspired by another bit of UK-US culture that, again, many of us of a certain age will be familiar with, and that is Alistair Cook's Letter from America.
It may be, I say it may be, that the Carter administration is overreacting with a violent, dying kick when it warns us.
Alistair Cook was a British journalist who spent most of his professional life in the United States, telling stories about topical issues. For more than 40 years, they were broadcast on BBC Radio on Friday evenings, and I used to be riveted to them. Now, much like Alistair Cook, my guest for this episode is from the UK, but has spent much of his professional life in the United States, and who currently lives near, well, I think you could probably guess where. But this episode doesn't just involve talk of mountains, blue or otherwise. It also covers the airline industry, airline data, and the use of standards. And about an organisation called the SES, a not-for-profit professional membership society based in the United States, dedicated to furthering the knowledge and use of standards. But not only that, there's also talk of running in airports, music, lucky fish, and an 8-year-old girl called Vanessa. And sandwiched in the middle of the two parts of my conversation with my guest, we'll also have a standards desk of news. But before we get to all of that, though this is a Matthew without Cindy episode, here is Cindy with a reminder. Actually, Cindy, where are you?
Well, actually, Matthew, I'm nowhere near the Blue Ridge Mountains, or any mountains, in fact, nor am I anywhere near the United States. I'm actually in Jakarta, Indonesia, to deliver a policy workshop on the role of standards in digital transformation. But through the magic of IT and audio standards, I'm here with you right now to give you a quick reminder that here on The Standard Show, we really welcome your feedback. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Find and follow us on Twitter @Standard Show and on Instagram at The Standard Show. And check out the show notes for all of the ways to get in touch.
My guest for this episode of The Standard Show is a 30-year veteran of airline pricing and revenue management. His first 10 years spent at British Airways. He is now head of standards and governance for ATPCO, the airline-owned organisation that collects airline product data content from over 400 airlines. He also collaborates with airline industry bodies such as IATA, ARC and A4A, the meaning of which I'm sure we'll get to understand. He has a graduate degree in business economics and accounting, is a member of the Chartered Institute of Management and Accounting, and obtained his Associate Standards Professional qualification with the Society for Standards Professionals, or SES, in 2019. He also serves as an executive board member and treasurer at the SES. But when he's not poring over data or changing the airline sector through standards, you will probably find him deep into his music. He has been a musician for over 30 years and a songwriter for 15 with his band My Lucky Fish, and has a pretty eclectic music taste, citing his love for pop, punk, classical and metal. Others might call that confused. And when he's not doing that, you'll find him donning his trainers and using every chance he has to discover new places, or a better way to rediscover old ones through running. And as we both discovered recently, we have a mutual friend that we've each known for more than 20 years. Hello, Linus. And also for 20 years, he has lived and worked in the United States. He is our man in America, kind of. He is David Mark Smith. Hello, David. Welcome to The Standard Show.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for having me. I will say you've already taken me back to my days in the UK by saying donning my trainers. I haven't used that word.
Donning, I know, donning. I know, it's a word I use a lot. I have no idea where that comes from. Now, David, you have lived and worked in the United States for the past 20 years. So I've got to ask you, is there anything you still miss about the old country?
I think practically it's really the history of it. So living around London as I did, I grew up in the suburbs of London, so I was on the tube, as we love to call it, around that area. But I think America's a much newer country, albeit a few hundred years now. It's always nice to go back to the home country, see parents, see the greenery of it, the simplicity of it, and take in that history. So certainly things I miss, but certainly made a home here as well for myself.
So people need to place you, Dave. Whereabouts in London? Where do you have to head back to?
So I was actually raised, I was born in Reading, but went to school. As you said, we have a mutual friend I was at school with for 6 years, Linus. That was in Northwood, which is in Hertfordshire. Actually, my parents now have retired down to Dorset. So you could argue one of England's greenest and pleasantest parts of the country now.
Absolutely. Now, David, I also mentioned My Lucky Fish and also Global Musicians Fish Pond. So come on, tell me about the music.
Yeah, I'd love to. So yeah, it's been a lifelong passion of mine, and I'm a great believer in that balance as well, and bringing that into everyday life. So as a musician, I guess I had a lot of pent up energy for songwriting, and I didn't really get to it until I was 40 years old. And having been, I know we'll get into the sort of standards role with ATPCO and the like. The short version is that I'd worked in the business of collecting data and distributing it in a standard format for my entire career. And I thought, I could apply this to the music industry for something for good, something very altruistic that would benefit people. And I found there were a lot of young people around that were producing music, weren't quite sure how to get it out there. So I just started conversing with a bunch of musicians, having written an album at that point, knowing what the process was. And really gathering musicians, both where I lived in America, but also through travel with work in multiple countries, and then putting out their product in a standard format. I have to say, it was altruistic. It wasn't a revenue maker ever. Musicians are quite well known for moving on to the next thing, rather than really focusing on the business side of things. But it's turned into a really nice archive of musicians, their content, and just been very personally satisfying, and made me a lot of new friends as well.
I love band names, right? So My Lucky Fish. What's that? Where's that from?
So I believe it's a common marketing truism that there needs to be heart in things for them to really work, and there really was heart in that name. It was my first gig out here in the US. And we had one audience member. Everyone else was milling around doing their own thing. and she was an 8-year-old girl called Vanessa. And she came up to the two of us, Rachel and myself, at the end. We didn't have a band name. And she presented us each with a little plastic fish that you can find being given out at fairgrounds here in the US, and said, "You've really made my day, the two of you. Love your music, and I'd like to give you my lucky fish." And there it was, the name, and it's lasted for all that time. Vanessa is probably, well, she will be in her 20s at this point, and probably has no idea of the impact.
Well, hello to Vanessa out there. It'd be amazing if she was listening. That's fantastic. So you're on stage as TBC, and then you came off stage and you became My Lucky Fish.
Exactly right. Very productive day.
Now, David, I want to come to your work at APTCO. But first, I want to get to your standards journey, and you've hinted at some of it already. Now, on the podcast, we ask pretty much all of our guests, how and when did it start for them? So I'll ask you, your standards journey, how and when did it start for you, and where are you now?
Yeah, so I think joining the airline industry as I did, and it was an interesting entry into the airline world. My auntie Liz worked in the personnel department at British Airways Revenue Accounting, and I found myself doing a summer job there. So I fell into the airline industry, fell in love with it, and I would say I spent probably the first 20 years of my career dealing with data, and very complex data for airlines, whether that was financial or revenue management or inventory availability, without really putting the term standards to it. And much later on in my career, sort of looking outside and seeing that there were so many people that shared the same business problems, the same the same challenges, I guess. And really what I'd been doing all of that time was dealing with standardized data. So I think I kind of came late to it from a formal perspective, but had always been dealing with interface standards and data. And coming from an accounting and business economics background, it came kind of naturally as well that was something I really enjoyed. So eventually came to be formalized through the work that I'm doing now at ATPCO as head of standards.
Now, this might not be an organisation that people may not be familiar with, and I want to ask you about the standards work that you do, but tell us about APTCO. What is it? What's the organisation about, and what does it do?
So and just to say, it's ATPCO. It's very common to change the P and the T around, but ATPCO.
I've written. This is the thing. I've written it down the wrong way. So there you go. Entirely my fault there.
Quite right. Well, at least we've given the audience
we have this thing called Clarifications Corner in the podcast, and we've done a live Clarifications Corner there. So ATPCO. Tell me, David.
Fantastic. So it's an organisation established in the 1960s, and basically it was the idea was a network economics model. I know there are many companies that kind of deal with that. That it's the idea that having an industry utility that does the kind of neutral, non-competitive stuff in the middle of an industry is a massive cost saving, rather than every single entity conversing with every single other entity out there. And in our case, it's getting information from airlines on their products, whether that's prices or whether it's services that they offer, the rules around the products that they're selling, and getting it out in a consistent format to channels to sell. So if you think about, for example, an Expedia or a Priceline, any travel agency you might buy from an airline's website, the airline intent of that offer has to be represented to the consumer in a consistent way, and that's really where we've come in. We're a big data company that is supported by standards that tell all of those consumers of the data how to present the airline's intent in a consistent way, and we have products around that to support it. So that's in essence that's the core of our business, and it supports disciplines for the airline across their business. Like, we talked about revenue management, revenue accounting. Those tend to be the back end sort of functions of airlines kind of analyzing their products, working out what to get to market, but also pricing and shopping, and these very complex things now, formulation of airline price and product, and presenting it to the consumer in a way that they can understand and comparatively shop easily.
And your role then, David, as head of standards and governance, what are the standards here? Is this private sector standards here, or is this using public, consensus-based international standards? Tell us about the standards work that you do.
Sure, yeah. So we actually we tend to call them proprietary standards that support the data that we put out. In fact, ATPCO has become a de facto standard over time because pretty much every airline that's getting their products and prices out to the marketplace uses ATPCO as an industry utility, therefore the standards that we have support across the industry. But yeah, they're not ISO standards. They're not ANSI certified standards. They are certainly our own proprietary set of documentation, just supporting an entire industry for pricing and shopping. So we maintain them ourselves. They are all under our own control. The governance piece is important to that. So you mentioned, head of standards and governance, our councils and our design teams that we use to move those standards forward and evolve them. Which, of course, from the 1960s, you can imagine how much evolution has happened of airlines getting their products to market. That's a really important component, to have an understandable, organized, transparent, especially as a neutral company for the industry, to have a transparent way of prioritizing and moving those forward. So in a nutshell, that's our standards and governance program.
Is there a relationship, though, David? You talked about them being proprietary, but is there a relationship with the international standards world, with the work that you do in your area of standards?
We don't typically go to the ISO standards side of things, although of course there are standards we adhere to as a company. So as a corporate, we certainly, as we've seen, standards on personal data, credit card data, that type of thing, we adhere to that. Really, where and you mentioned at the start as well, working with companies like IATA, the International Airline Transport Association, Airlines for America, otherwise known as A4A, Airlines Reporting Corporation. Those are the companies that represent bits of the airline supply chain that make that whole distribution of the product to the market work. So those are the standards that we work with. In essence, we characterize our technical standards into three pieces. One of them is the interface standards. So that's the data elements that we have and distribute and descriptions of them. We have processing standards, which say, you got all this raw data, here's how you put it all together. And then the piece that refers to this question that you asked is supporting services standards, how pricing and shopping works and interacts with the rest of the industry, and how a priced airline product gets onto a ticket and can be serviced for a change or a refund that a consumer might ask for, how it gets accounted for. All of those things need to work together. And I will say, I do find, in 30 years in the airline industry, I find it amazing that you have a global industry that just works. So you could buy an airline ticket anywhere in the world, and that ticket is going to look the same, and it can take you all the way around the world, and it just works. And there's such a fundamental set of standards and data and systems, of course, that makes that work.
So it's interesting to say that, there, David, about the you can buy this ticket and it will be effectively the same experience around the world. Has that always been the case, though, with the airline industry?
I think it's something that's evolved over time. So really good question, because I think we've moved through the era of automation. So of course, airline bookings and reservations and ticketing was a very, very manual process. When I joined the industry 30 years ago, we were in the world of paper tickets, and they were carbon copies as well. And I think we've seen a couple of things happen throughout the industry. We've seen widespread automation, electronic tickets, and now we're kind of seeing a retailing revolution as well. As we get to sort of much more of an offer and order mentality. But also deregulation has happened in our industry as well. Now, it was before I joined it, so much of that was during the 1980s. But as deregulation came on and the market opened up to competition and less regulated routes for flying, then there was far more opportunity for it to work together. So I think really the summary of that is that each country tended to have their domestic way of doing things. And then over time, again, that network economics model worked really, really well for that business. So as it globalized, it's just saved a lot of cost and just became a really natural thing to do for these kind of utility areas, which allowed for sort of a neutral company like ours, our mission really talks about us as a neutral, honest broker as well, and allowed that to exist. So it's an evolution, and it will continue to evolve over time. I mean, who knows politically where the world's going, globalization versus reverse of globalization, but those standards and those processes will always be there to support the consumer.
Now, we'll pick up the second part of my conversation with David shortly. But first, let's have the Standards Desk of News. Standards for Artificial Intelligence. A new initiative to improve how AI is used across the economy, including in sectors such as healthcare, transport and finance, was launched earlier this month. The AI Standards Hub is led by the Alan Turing Institute in partnership with BSI and the National Physical Laboratory, and is supported by the UK Government Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport and the Office for AI. It is all part of the government's National AI Strategy, a 10-year plan which aims to build on the UK's strengths in AI. The idea is that the AI Standards Hub will ensure that industry, regulators, civil society and academic researchers have the tools and knowledge they need to contribute to the development of standards and make informed use of published standards to advance trustworthy and responsible AI. Political agreement on the European Standardization System. Earlier this month, negotiators from the European Parliament and the Council of the EU struck a political agreement on the amendment proposed to Regulation 1025, which regulates standardisation in Europe. Regulation 1025 governs how EU legislation is supported by the three European standards bodies, CEN, CENELEC and ETSI. The amendment to the regulation is part of the new European Standardization Strategy, published by the European Commission in February, which aims to strengthen the role of European standards in the internal market and on the global stage. In particular, the amendment aims to enhance the role of national standards bodies in EU and EFTA member countries in the development of harmonised standards to support EU legislation. A harmonised standard is a European standard developed by CEN, CENELEC or ETSI following a request from the European Commission. And talking of CEN and CENELEC, they recently announced the winners of their Standards and Innovation Awards, which celebrate the important contribution of research and innovation to standardisation. To find out who won and for more information on the other stories, check out the links in the show notes. And that's the Standards Desk of News. Now let's return to my conversation with David. We ended part one discussing the role of standards for what David does working with airline data. In part two, I started by asking David that given his 30-year career in this field, where might standards be needed next?
Yeah, that is a great question. Actually, it's one that we're in the middle of at the moment. There's a lot going on in the airline industry that which really is at a point where, I mentioned this journey to automation. So if you kind of think about how visible this is to the consumer, I'm not so sure, but you kind of think about airlines have their prices, their inventory, their reservations, their ticketing, their servicing, and it's very much an evolved kind of chain of automation. I think, when we think about the modern world of retailing, and certainly airline retailing, there's much more keenness for it to be what I called an offer and order mentality. So you think about how we shop in a modern retailing environment is really not a sort of, we buy a ticket, we have a coupon that represents what we're going to claim in the future. It's all a bundle of services that we can easily change, and payments are becoming more complex. So there's a lot of effort being put into where it's appropriate to standardize for those things, for modern airline retailing, versus where it's important to innovate. So you think about channels that are selling airline tickets need to be able to innovate, not in a standard way. They need to innovate in a competitive way on how they're displaying to their consumer base, for example. So it's a really interesting journey to see where that line lands. Actually, one of my favorite challenges from a few years ago was, don't standards get in the way of innovation? I've always thought that standards actually are the only way to innovate at scale. It's the only way you can move forward. So, interesting times still to be written. Maybe a future episode if you ever have me back.
Well, it is an interesting conundrum, isn't it? Because I think you're right. On the surface, you might think, well, if you standardise something, you are stifling that creativity and innovation. But I'm interested in what you say there. How, maybe give us an example of how standards have allowed you to, as you said, to innovate at scale. How has that taken place?
Yeah, so I think generally, so our business is kind of notorious for it, that you'll see innovation happen, and of course everyone wants to innovate the business, but once you start getting into the complexity of airlines having to do business together or deal with multiple channels or sell in offline points or allowing change and refund or complicated rules with their products that allow them to revenue manage and sell them at the right price, then you start to find that those innovators kind of come back for the bits that they really want to use as more of a utility and more of a kind of a neutral service. So we have a history of that. An example, I guess it ties to my accounting background. I worked on a solution for tax calculation for consumer itineraries, and every pricing system in the world had built their own version of calculation taxes. And then everyone realized that there was no point maintaining that code, that actually having a central point of distribution for everything tax related, so that there were standards around it, there was data, and it served every pricing system in the world, was an important way to scale. So that is the best example I have, really, of the whole world fragmented and then came back to this industry solution, and it's a much cheaper way of moving forward. And it took from 2006 design, 2010 implementation, 2021 finally the last big pricing system in the world implemented ATPCO tax. So we're there, and there's a big network economic benefit from that. It just takes time to do so, but great example there of let the world innovate, but then when it doesn't make sense because it's more of a neutral thing, then you bring it back in and have the cost savings, and then the world can concentrate on innovating on the things that are really important and competitive out there. I think maybe just from a personal perspective, it was actually a lovely move, just personally for me, to go from an airline that, of course, an airline absolutely competitive, listed on the stock exchange. I was with British Airways for 10 years. And it's, although we're a business, as a neutral, honest broker for the industry, that was a lovely place to go professionally. For me, I've always, as I said, with the music side of things, believed in that there needs to be heart in what you do. And it's as near to altruistic as you get, to kind of be at the center of the industry and only exist to provide value to that industry through fast, accurate, and scaled industry solutions. So just been a lovely 20-year journey. It's why I'm still here 20 years on at the same company.
So, David, you also I mentioned in your introduction, the rather floral introduction to this episode, that you obtained your Associate Standards Professional qualification with the Society for Standards Professionals, or SES, in 2019. Now, I've just noticed, where's the E? What is it? Where's the E in SES? Tell me.
Interesting one, isn't it? Yeah. So SES, so Society for Engineering Standards, was actually founded in 1947. So it's a very very tenured non-profit organization for standards professionals, and the name was modernized. The acronym was not just yet. So SES, has the same principles it always had. Basically, it's there for standards professionals, for professional development, for networking. There's certification, as you mentioned. It was my place of choice when I was looking around for getting a certification as a standards professional. We have leadership opportunities. As I said, I'm on the board of the SES for the last couple of years, as well as their treasurer, and just being able to engage in events that allow for education, but also allow a lot of discussion on best practice and kind of thought leadership among fellow standards professionals. I certainly found that moving to that industry agnostic environment where lots of people had all the same challenges around standards, was a really refreshing place to be, to step out of aviation where I have been, and I love being, have been for 30 years, and look at it from a completely industry neutral perspective. So that's the lowdown on SES, and it's been only a 3-year journey for me so far, but a very valuable one for sure.
And give us an insight to some of the other people that might be members of this organisation. Is it people who are working in proprietary standards like yourself, or is it also professionals who are involved in the sort of formal infrastructure of the standards world, working on ISO standards or ANSI and that sort of thing? Give us an insight to the sort of people that are members of SES.
Sure thing. Yeah, we have all sorts. It's one of the things that makes it really attractive, that there's a lot of different sectors. So we do have industry people such as myself. So, of course, there are standards that are proprietary within industry. We have pure standards developing organizations who are members. We have people that are very involved in government in the US and globally, and academia as well. Academia is very plugged in to the standards environment, and it is an interesting thing as well that although a lot of our membership right now is US based, there are notable members globally as well. So we do get that kind of global input. And I will say, I was just in Geneva, and it was an aviation meeting with IATA last week, and I happened to meet a colleague from SES who is based in Geneva with the IEC. So that was a really nice opportunity as well to, again, network, share ideas, and where we're at in our standards journey.
So as an organisation, David, I just wonder how, is it unique within the States, or are there other similar organisations that have coalesced around a particular type of standards makers, or, is it unique?
Yeah, we certainly feel, and again, full disclosure, I'm on the board of SES, but so I would
you would say this anyway.
In our uniqueness and the value. But we certainly, we very genuinely as a non-profit believe we are unique, that ability to be able to network so broadly across industries for any type of standards activities, and actually get to meet service providers who serve that industry as well. It is a unique thing. And actually, as I mentioned, 3 years ago, becoming head of standards at ATPCO, I started taking the standards thing very seriously and was looking around, and SES was the obvious choice for me. I mean, it was literally a search for whoever might be able to afford me networking and certification and development opportunities, and SES was it, and very long established. And by the way, just an aside, really interesting one. My stepmom, who's, I mentioned, she's down in Dorset now, and she was in academia in business economics for a long time teaching, and said, "Oh yeah, I remember the Society for Engineering Standards. I used to do business with them back in the 1950s." So that was kind of an interesting tie as well. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, and the name has been known for a long time.
Oh my goodness, it's come full circle for the family then. There's a family connection.
Full circle for the family, exactly.
Actually, David, tell us about this qualification. You talked about certification, sort of get accredited for the work that you do. Tell us about the actual qualification that you took.
Yeah, sure. So we have 2 levels. We have an associate and a certified standards professional, and obviously they're 2 different levels. The associate involves learning, taking an exam, taking a certain amount of courses, and attendance of webinars. So it's really that basic commitment to growing as a professional. Certified kind of gets you to that level beyond, where you need to be writing a paper or speaking with authority on a standard subject, and it's certainly something, again, I mentioned in my other life in the airline world, standards evolve. At SES, we're always looking at how to modernize, digitize, become more appealing, and we're certainly looking at our certification process as well, for how that does serve the industry best. And certainly I know we have a lot of attention at the moment on diversity, equity, inclusion, and also our young and emerging professionals, and looking to engage that community in how we can better serve the globe, basically, with that standard certification.
So, David, as a final thought, then I mentioned in the introduction there about you donning your trainers, and donning is one of those terms we both we bonded over the word donning. Have you donned your trainers today, or will you be donning your trainers to go out running again in that lovely Virginia countryside?
I certainly will, and actually, I will say, the aviation world certainly affords some opportunities. I ran around the airport at Geneva last week, and it's something I've done twice now. But going through 2 country borders, it's a 7-miler to go around. So that was a good one last week. I'm sort of sleeping off the jet lag a bit. I'm actually running on the runway at Dulles Airport. There's a 5K, not an unofficial version. There is an official race on the runway on Saturday this week. So I'll be doing that with my wife and my little 3-year-old boy, Ellis, on Saturday. So some good opportunities coming up.
Do you only ever run on airport runways or around airports?
It's starting to sound that way, but no, I do, and I will say I do remember, Matthew. The first question that you asked me when we met was, "What do you see out of your window right now?" And I will say, for everyone else listening, it's not that different out of my window, but I'm 20 minutes from the Blue Ridge Mountains, so there are some great running opportunities there.
The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. That's taken me back to Laurel and Hardy, if anyone needs to have that reference.
Exactly
rammed home for them. I suppose, given that you work in the airlines industry, I shouldn't be surprised, should I? Because you fly in and out of airports all the time, I should think.
Exactly.
So, David, that's amazing what you just said there, because I've got 2 children, right? I've got a son called Reuben and a daughter called Senan. And if I'd ever had a 3rd child, I would have called them Ellis. How about that?
I love it. And, Ellis, actually, there's no family history to Ellis. It purely came from me being a first-generation immigrant to the US. So perhaps that's a good tie to the whole story from America thing, that Ellis Island, of course, was the way many people came into the US. And we just thought that was a very appropriate name for a second-generation Brit now in the US.
So, David Mark Smith, thank you so much for talking to The Standard Show.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew. Great talking to you today.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
So, my thanks to David Smith for chatting to me for this episode. For more information about the SES, the Society for Standards Professionals, check out the link in the show notes.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.